Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning into this session on how can Europe enhance data sharing cooperation with its allies, which is a part of the Centre for Data Innovations conference dedicated to AI policy. I'm Natalia, and I'm the Senior Consultant in the Tech, Media and Telecoms team at FTI Consulting, and I'll be your host for this session. Just before we begin, I wanted to remind our audience that you can ask questions to the panelists in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll ensure that we can create some interaction towards the end of this panel. Prior to introducing our guests and diving into the conversation, I just wanted to say a few words about the panel's topic to give ourselves some background to start with. As we all know, the essential building blocks of AI, well, one of them is data. Without good quality data feeding into algorithms, we're not able to create successful artificial intelligence. In particular, broader access to data can support organizations around the world in developing AI-related technologies, benefiting multiple nations in the process. Yet issues can arise over data sharing. For example, how to make data sets usable for applications, how to ensure openness does not expose sensitive information, and how not to threaten the security of platforms. But with closer cooperation with our economic allies, we can provide important solutions to these challenges and boost development and the use of AI. With me today, we have a fantastic panel of actually 5 speakers to discuss this topic. From the Commission perspective, we have Bruno Gencarelli, who is Head of Unit for International Data Flows and Protection at DG Just. We have Robert Sinclair, who's Minister Councillor and Deputy Head of Mission of the Mission of Canada to the European Union. From the business side of things, we had Guido Lobrano, who's Vice President of Policy, Director General for Europe at ITI. From the UK side, we have Sue Daly, who's Associate Director of Technology and Innovation at Tech UK. And our surprise guest, who we're so lucky to have, is Torsten Hulsmann, who's CFO for International Data Spaces Association. So without further ado, I'd like to kick off the panel with my first question to Mr. Gencarelli. As I know, Mr. Gencarelli, you only have 45 minutes with us on this session. So first of all, as regard the recently unveiled Data Governance Act and the Data Act that will be announced in early 2021, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on how you see these pieces of legislation facilitating trustworthy AI applications. Over to you, Mr. Gencarelli. I'm so sorry. It seems like we have a little problem with Mr. Gencarelli. So I suppose I will just continue on and bring in the third country perspective. Mr. Sinclair, thank you so much for being with us today. The EU-Canada Leaders Summit that happened in October celebrated the 3-year anniversary of the EU-Canada Strategic Partnership Agreement, which aimed to advance bilateral cooperation on digital policy, focusing on AI, quantum computing, and protecting democratic values in a digital world. Leaders highlighted the close EU-Canadian cooperation on digital transformation and on using AI and digital technologies to support the COVID-19 recovery. And so on to my question. In this context, how are Canadian and European companies and research organizations partnering to develop AI technology together, using data from both sides of the Atlantic? And is there room for perhaps improving this collaboration?
Thanks so much, Natalie. I hope you can still hear me okay. Before I get into the detail of your question, I thought I'd just lay a little bit of a foundation for what you will hear from me through the rest of the panel, and that is that our basic economic outlook for Canada really informs our approach to this sector of the economy. We're one of the most open economies in the world. 65% of our GDP stems from two-way trade. We have free trade agreements with all of our other G7 partners, with a little asterisk beside the UK. We just worked through our transition agreement there. And so this really provides a foundation for our approach on the importance of free flow of data. And, you know, I think everybody probably has the same stat of potential of $11 trillion additional added to the economy through free flow of data by 2025. So that's sort of the philosophical underpinning of our approach to data flows. In terms of the AI sector itself in Canada, we've got a supercluster in Montreal dedicated to AI, another supercluster in British Columbia on digital, and this is basically these are public-private partnerships that bring together all aspects of the equation: business, government, academia, research, civil society angles too, to help us drive a sort of holistic approach to these issues. We also have 800 startups in AI, one of the fastest startup rates, 600 partnerships with businesses on AI, and we've got our $125 million pan-Canadian AI strategy, and so on. But to your question, your specific question, having laid that foundation, I think the pandemic in particular demonstrated that our research and business networks are really very well connected and can really produce some good cooperation on on issues of common interest. So one example is Canadian company Blue Dot, which developed a modeling system that evaluated and predicted the spread of COVID-19. And they collaborated with a couple of the most advanced European supercomputing centers, Sinica and BSC in Bologna and Barcelona, in the early stages of the pandemic. In June, DG Research and Innovation hosted an online networking event to promote and facilitate collaboration between COVID-19 projects and initiatives in the EU and international partners like us. And I think there were 4 Canadian projects that were amongst those selected. We also have a regular digital dialogue to discuss our respective data and digital policy developments. We've had 2 this year in June and September to share best practices. And in particular, AI and the fight against COVID were a particular focus in these latest dialogues. And just last week, I hosted a high-level virtual event with 27 universities from the EU and Canada. And there was a real focus there on AI in medical research. And I'd say the overall discussion really showed the strong alignment in our research agendas. I would add that on data, interestingly, one of the things that came out was the need to increase the quantity and quality of data as well as its security as a sort of an underpinning cross-cutting issue. So unless you want me to go further, there's plenty more. I'll cut myself off there on that question.
No, that's really helpful, and thank you so much for giving us a bit of background on your superclusters and the holistic approach that you're taking on AI as background to my question and your answer. I think we're still experiencing difficulties with Bruno Gencarelli, sadly, but at this point, I'd love to bring in kind of more of the business perspective. So I'm wondering if Guido Lobrano, you might answer the question. At ITI, you have a broad range of global members, from cloud service providers and online marketplaces to software companies and more. Can you identify any common issues or themes as to how major global firms can enhance data sharing globally?
Thank you, Natalia. I hope you can hear me well. As ITI, we represent a broad range of global tech companies from the United States, Europe, and Asia. And there's certainly a number of common themes that come up every time we discuss these issues, we talk about, in particular, data sharing. And so the first one is obviously how digital innovation broadly relies on the availability of large and diverse data sets. This is what enables developers to innovate across the industries. And so one very important thing is that balanced national frameworks for access to public data sets are so critical. And the second point is that obviously we need to also incentivize both private companies and the public sector to make even more data available. For example, through data sharing schemes that need to be open and non-discriminatory. Incentives to do so could include, for example, tax schemes or compensation for the data that is shared. When we talk about particularly business-to-business data sharing, I think I need to stress that this is where things must remain voluntary. We cannot risk disincentivizing investment in innovation, or, for example, putting at risk intellectual property rights or trade secrets. Another very important theme that obviously always comes up and relates both to personal data and non-personal data is international flows of data. These are clearly crucial for both big and small companies. And there is no way around the fact that the development of new technologies, AI or other, relies on global data flows. So governments also need to facilitate the cross-border movement of data. And this, among other things, means maximizing interoperability, but also the convergence across various data governance regimes. And there is no, in our view, there is no incompatibility between this goal and pursuing legitimate privacy objectives or economic or security objectives. We believe they are certainly compatible. And then the final point, which relates more to what we should not be doing, is about data localization. Data localization, in our view, are clearly a measure that is a threat to the development of artificial intelligence. And also, most importantly, they are never the answer to possible security concerns. There is really no direct correlation between where the data is stored and its level of protection. In most cases, actually, localization does not increase the security or the privacy of this data. So, this is just a list of a few, I think, common themes that always come up in the private business context.
Thank you, Guido. That's incredibly interesting. You touched on quite a few very topical issues, namely whether or not to localize data, the importance of cross-border flow of data and the necessity for it to be interoperable. I'm wondering if I can bring in the UK perspective. Ms. Daly, you are at Tech UK, you champion your members and their technology so they can prepare and empower the UK for what comes next. I'm wondering what would be the best case scenario for you and the members that you represent as regard Brexit and the future of data transfers to the UK and back?
Well, it's great to be with you all today. I think originally we were meant to be meeting in person, but it's great to be here virtually, and thanks for the question. So in terms of what we think is key and what we are looking for, I think we've been quite consistent since the referendum result that what we really want to see and what our members really want to see is for the UK to achieve a data adequacy agreement with the EU as part of, obviously the discussions that are happening right now. And that really remains a key priority for the UK. And of course, we wish everybody that is currently locked in negotiations and talking, we wish them well in their work. This is really important, the data adequacy agreement, of course, not just for the UK and for not just my sector and my industry, the technology sector, but of course, every sector across the whole of the economy to ensure data can continue to flow between the EU and the UK as it currently does. But it's also important for, I think, for the EU and for member states and for organisations developing products and tools and technologies that they obviously want to provide to the UK citizens as well. So we see it as important for both sides, but it's really where our focus is. on the future of data transfers, I'm sure we'll get into this. There's a lot there, as Guido touched on, and I think for me, it's it is that keeping that that global conversation about how global data flows are really important for the future of these technologies and other key technologies. But it's how you develop and how you pursue international data transfers with trust. That word hasn't come up yet, and I think it's really, really fundamental in how you do that. And having, of course, a data transfer regime that is clear, it's consistent, it's transparent, is really important. And obviously, that is what we will be looking for in the UK to have as it becomes a third country and has to put its own international regime in place. But then what we would look for the UK, and I hope others, and obviously we're quite global here today, is to look to build those bridges with those around international data flows in having a global conversation about how we do this, how we all do this, how we all get this right in a way that builds trust, builds confidence, and enables technologies like AI that, as Robert's already touched on, has some really good solutions to common challenges that we're all facing, particularly right now and going forward. That's really key, I think, to what we need to do going ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Daly. That's super interesting, and I like the idea of having a global conversation, and it's fantastic that we're here today to facilitate that global conversation, so to speak. I'm wondering at this point, I think that ties quite nicely to a question I had for Mr. Torsten Hulsmann as regard international data spaces and how we can perhaps facilitate those. So my question is, the EU is planning to create common trusted European data spaces, but for transatlantic cooperation on AI, should we be thinking more about a transatlantic data space or even a global data space? And why should these data spaces be EU data spaces as opposed to transatlantic or global? I'm wondering if I can put that to you.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Natalia, for bringing me into the discussion. And I would propose to just set up international data spaces, because this is what you just asked for. No, but I think maybe to also explain a little bit what International Data Spaces Association is bringing into this debate. Well, we are an association which was established some 5 years ago in 2016 by industry. Even though it is an association under German law, we have, for the time being, some 130 members from 22 countries. And most of these members are industry companies, corporations from either IT or software, or from manufacturing or other domains. And why have these companies decided in 2016 to start this endeavor of international data spaces? It is exactly because of what we just discussed in the last 20 minutes. It is that, well, everyone knows now that data is the new oil, and everyone focused throughout the last decade, so to say, on interoperability, on data exchange, and also on these buzzwords like sharing economy or data-centric services. But I think what we also witnessed throughout the last years is that companies want to link data without regret. Yeah? And this is then, well, referring to trusts, what Sue just mentioned. Companies care about data ownership, even though in a legal form, data ownership does not exist. They care about data security, and also they care about data value. And therefore, in the core of International Data Spaces Association, we put this word of data sovereignty, but sovereignty not understood in a geographical or country interpretation, but understood as the ability of a natural or a legal person, so a company, to exclusively and sovereignly decide concerning the usage of data as an economic asset. And I think this is also the starting point of the European approach of data spaces, bringing into the discussion a peer-to-peer network or a federated platform which allows companies and organizations to somehow control their data. And so International Data Spaces Association proposed already some 2 years ago a reference architecture model which which directly provides a trusted way of sharing data as a peer-to-peer network without any central data storages in between. And this is also the reason why we are one of the 18 founding members of the Gaia X cloud federated cloud initiative, which was recently established in the European Union. So this is maybe just a starting point for the discussion, and also a little bit linking to your question.
Lovely, thank you. Can I just see if we have Mr. Giancarelli there? No, I don't think we do, sadly. Okay, so sadly I can't bring him into this discussion quite yet, hoping we can in a moment or two. Thank you, Mr. Hulsmann. That was really interesting, especially the Gaia X piece. I followed the summit and it was incredibly interesting and nice to hear from someone who was there.
Yes,
joining.
I am trying.
Yes. Hi there, Mr. Giancarelli. Can you hear me? No, I don't think we've got him, sadly. Mr. Sinclair, I think I'm going to turn to you now. I'm wondering if you might be able to bring the discussion a little bit back to AI, because that's what we're discussing here at this summit overall. I know this panel's more linked to kind of data specifically, but I know that Canada has been very active in the AI space. So the Global Partnership on AI, GPHA, is, as many of our listeners know, an initiative that was driven by the G7, but mainly by France and Canada. And we actually expect the first annual GPHA multi-stakeholder experts group plenary to be hosted in Canada this month. I'm wondering if you could provide an update on the latest as regards GPHA's progress and the work of the GPHA Data Governance Working Group in particular.
Sure. Well, yeah, absolutely. And again, to take a very quick step back on GPHA, it really reflects that holistic multi-stakeholder approach that Canada is trying to bring to these issues, and bring in that international angle as well, on which we put a lot of faith in getting us to a good space on these issues. Specifically, we're hosting the inaugural plenary Thursday, Friday, December 3rd and 4th, actually, in Montreal. We'll have over 200 AI experts there. There's the 4 working groups will be reporting: Future of Work, Innovation and Commercialization, which are led by France; Responsible AI and Data Governance are Canadian leads. It'll be the start of our chair as the GPHA Council for 2021. And as the first chair, we're going to be looking to advance a vision for a global AI ecosystem that protects citizens' privacy and data, enables responsible and trustworthy innovation, and fosters diversity across the AI domain. And that goes back to Sue's point about trust. Without trust, you're not going to get the data flows, and that's a key priority for Canada domestically. So the governance working group mandate is to support cutting edge research and applied AI projects, with the objective of promoting the collection, use, sharing, archiving, and deletion of data for AI in ways that are consistent with our shared commitment to the OECD principles on trustworthy AI. And again, there's that multilateral angle to it as well. So they're supported, the governance working group is supported by a center of expertise in Montreal, which brings together 30 experts from industry, civil society, governments, and academia. And we're very lucky to have Professor Venderhorst from the University of Vienna, who was nominated by the EU to lead GPHA's work to develop a data governance framework. So the objectives of the working group's first project are to situate the importance of data in AI development, and to identify both areas where data would be more useful, such as specific open data sets that could be worthy of national support or international collaboration, and where harms arise due to the collection of or access to data. And for its second project, experts will develop a data governance framework with the aim of guiding the scope and structure of the working group's medium-term work, including by defining the most relevant terms, outlining existing data governance frameworks, and developing a roadmap for further discussion. So there's a bit of housekeeping, I would say, and agenda setting there in that second project.
Great, that's really nice to have kind of a rundown of what they're focusing on, and wishing you all the best also for that meeting that will be happening, I think Thursday and Friday, you said, which will be coming up. Actually, I'll continue with you, Mr. Sinclair, if that's okay, turning now more to the sort of data angle. As we all know, the European Court of Justice recently invalidated the EU-US Privacy Shield, yet Canada has successfully established cross-border data flows with both the EU and the US. I'm wondering, how has Canada found common ground between both parties, and what advice might you give to the negotiators, you know, at the US mission and DG Just, trying to improve data sharing between the EU and the US?
Sure. I'll perhaps tackle the second part of your question first, because it'll be a shorter answer. And as a diplomat, it's always best practice not to get in the middle of a negotiation between two other parties. But I would say that you know, with the hit the world's economy has taken from COVID, we need our economies firing on all cylinders on all sides. And you know, industry, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic has a vested interest in the EU and the US moving forward. So we're watching very closely and hoping for an early and a good outcome for everyone. You know, there's more than enough business uncertainty these days. So we wish them both the best for an early resolution. In terms of how we approach things, you know, I've already hit on a few key themes that we focus on: multi-stakeholder, multilateral approach on AI governance based on human rights. So we're committed to a multi-stakeholder approach that involves government, private sector, civil society, and researchers. An inclusive approach is also necessary to address AI's multifaceted economic, social, political, and security impacts. And I would say, you know, just one example of how we sort of mainstream that inclusive approach to trade under our comprehensive economic trade agreement with the EU, CETA. We are actually having a civil society forum, the third civil society forum, next week, December 8th and 9th. We also promote AI governance in multilateral forums like the G7, UN, OECD, and engage like-minded partners like the EU to shape the norms and develop frameworks for AI based on our commitment to human rights and support for rules-based international order. I'd say more fundamentally, it can sound trite sometimes, but you can never discount or underestimate the impact of those shared values and reference points. That's the trust on which systems work together. And I really, really have to stress that. And you see it when the leaders get together. They have the same frame of reference. You know, leaders trust, you know, you've got the same shared values. Leaders trust, and they engage at a different level, and they drive the deliverables, if you will. So how, you know, I think the holistic approach that we bring to these issues helps us develop partnerships with people all over and countries all over the world, but it's the shared values as well that I really, really can't understate.
Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. Yeah, I like the idea of shared values and this multi-stakeholder approach. it sounds like it's sort of all working out very well between the EU and Canada, especially with the adequacy agreement. Did you want to add something else? Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I'd be remiss though in also flagging that one of the issues that we are watching closely, as Guido touched on, is data localization. That's a strong concern for us. 34 countries have data localization laws by our latest count. And it's certainly one of the market issues that we hear about from Canadian companies. So I'd be remiss in not mentioning that, and that we continue to work to support bilateral and multilateral commitments related to the cross-border transfer of information. And in fact, that's the free flow of data is incorporated into CPTPP and our updated North American Free Trade Agreement as well. So you have to look at all sides of the equation always, I would say.
Yes, indeed. Data localization popping up again. Actually, I'm wondering if I might bring Sue Daly in at this point, especially given the negotiations currently happening and the challenges that might be arising around those negotiations. Possibly localization is one of them. I'm wondering, what do you believe is the most challenging variable that needs to be addressed between the EU and the UK to make a data transfer agreement possible?
So one of the key issues that we are looking at, and in terms of where our members are looking at, would be around issue of onward transfer of data, which I think touches on the conversation we're having as well. So we believe from when the UK and the EU will have the same data protection standards at the point of exit from the starting point. However, we of course will be looking at what we need to do to make sure we have mechanisms in place to ensure that data that as it travels around the world, and we're looking at, kind of the international conversations around more the globalization of data, how we ensure that EU citizens' data, when it's being transferred, is protected, is secured, and there is still that trust. This is a challenging issue, but I think it's not beyond the wit of man to address, and others have addressed it, like the EU and Canada, the EU and Japan in their arrangements. So I think that's one of the issues that I think will be key to moving forward. Ultimately, it may be a challenge, but I think the greater challenge would be not having an adequacy agreement in place. So we still think that's an absolute key priority and focus right now for our members.
Yeah, good to hear, and such a shame that Bruno Gencarelli can't join us in the end, because I would have loved to kind of ask him more about the negotiations and where he stands on all of this. But just going back to kind of very effective agreements around the world, I'm wondering if, Guido Lobrano, you might speak to whether there are any prime examples of existing data transfer agreements between two jurisdictions that can be viewed as a gold standard, and if you have one in mind in particular, why would you choose that one?
Thanks. It's obviously a complex issue. There are different types of data transfer agreements. There are those who primarily seek to protect privacy rather than directly facilitate the transfer of data. This is the kind of provisions we have in the GDPR, for example, with adequacy. Then there is a second type, which is what you find in a trade agreement, one of them is US-Mexico-Canada agreement that I'm sure Robert knows well. That has a chapter, a digital chapter that addresses data transfers. In this context, it's important to underline that appropriate trade provisions do not interfere with or weaken existing data protection laws, but are strong enough at the same time to counter protectionist measures. Then there is a third type, and I think that's where we would find this sort of gold standard in a way, and that's when you look at a data transfer agreement that would be specifically designed to protect the privacy of data across borders. And one example is the APEC cross-border privacy rule system. This is a government-backed system with privacy certification for companies to demonstrate compliance with internationally recognized data privacy protections. So one could say this is a system that is a gold standard in a way because it is multilateral, and so it's more scalable than an adequacy approach, for example. And also because this is a system that sits on top of the laws of the countries that participate, and so doesn't really affect these laws directly. One final thought, which I think is important, there is additional complexity that lies in the growing trend to address third-country transfers of non-personal data as well. And so we've talked about adequacy, we've talked about the importance of personal data, of course. But if you look at the recent Data Governance Act from the European Commission, for example, a lot of that is about non-personal data. So in these cases, you don't have a data protection justification to restrict non-personal data flows. There are, of course, other valid interests, like, for example, intellectual property protection or protection of trade secrets. But then the trade restrictions with no fundamental rights basis, they really must be very well scoped. They need to be very clearly motivated, and they need to be proportionate. And they also need to take into account potential pre-existing tools to protect those rights. So I think, going back to your question, the answer would be something that is government-backed private certification for companies to demonstrate reliance on international privacy protections.
That's really useful to hear, and thank you for giving us a complete rundown on you and your members' perspectives. I'm just wondering if I bring in Torsten Hulsmann at this point. I just wanted to kind of ask you about which challenges to data sharing should the Commission address in the framework to ensure businesses take part, and when is government intervention necessary versus private sector-led efforts? In other words, can data spaces be governed by industry-led self-regulation?
Well, I think, first of all, they have to be regulated by industry in first instance. And thank you, yes, for this twofold questions. I want also to relate my answer to the statement of Robert he did before on the common values, which are very important. And I think this is also what the EU data strategy envisages, to have the European data values. And we were asking ourselves, well, what are these EU data values, or well, maybe a data governance and common values which are related to EU values. And I think we have to have a look to the fair data principles. This is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And if we focus on for instance, on the reusable topic of data, then I think we also can clearly have an interesting perspective that, well, organizational or legal enforcement, which we currently witness, will be replaced by technical enforcement in the near future. And then it is always a little bit a mixture between the legal perspective, which we discussed in the last minutes, but also the question how this legal framework could be enforced technologically. And I think this is exactly where IDSA, my organization, worked on the last 2 or 3 years. And well, if people ask us, what are you doing? Well, we are enabling AI applications. We are enabling companies to really participate. Because I think in the previous statement of Guido, he said that, well, we have to make or the available data sets have to be bigger than today. And I think this is also very important. With such a data sovereign approach, I think we will overcome the challenges that not all companies really participate in data sharing, and not all companies really wanting to, well, share data to come up with new possibilities. And maybe finally, if we see these data spaces approach by the Commission, I think it was when it was published in February more an announcement. There were no real interpretations or definitions coming up with this data spaces approach, and therefore I think it's now well, the challenge of the upcoming months and maybe the upcoming year to really find the building blocks, how to build data spaces and to agree upon these common values, but also to agree upon the common design principles for these data spaces. And for us, the positive effect will be no silos any longer. We know this from decades, software silos, no data silos. We have to enlarge the data pool, as Guido just explained. And I think this is also utmost important. We have benefits from cross-sectoral data exchange and data sharing, because what we can see in business is that still companies from one domain have their own principles, their own common values, their own governance on setting up data sharing mechanisms. But I think the real sex and the real USPs lie in cross-sectoral benefits, also bringing data from different data endpoints, from open data, from closed data, from secret data, to really unleash the potential of AI in the future.
Great, thank you. And just a quick follow-up question to that. What are your thoughts on the recently launched Data Governance Act that was released by the Commission on Wednesday? Just a few little tidbits from you on that would be great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, well, a lot of things which we already proposed 2 years ago in our first version of the reference architecture model on international data spaces. And I think, well, we have to really differentiate between data in motion and maybe data in rest, because companies usually do not care where data is saved. They just want to make sure that that certain usage constraints are somehow enforced, and therefore these geographically well interpreted way of data regulation usually is not so important for companies, only if real legal issues appear, for instance, now with the Privacy Shield or other data protection regulations. So these are maybe just two very minor comments, but I think we already, well, we are on a good track. And I think what is now the challenge of the future, to bring technology and legal perspectives to merge and to really, well, fill the data spaces approach in the data strategy, or to bring it to life, so to say.
Great, thank you. I know the Data Governance Act is very topical because it did just come out last week. So if any of the other panelists wanted to make a further comment on the Governance Act in particular. Yes, Guido, over to you.
Thanks. I'm happy to have a go at that. And I agree with a lot of the things that Thorsten has said. As you said, this has been published a week ago, and it's a very dense proposal, so it takes time to digest it and to have an opinion. But if you look at the development of the Data Governance Act, we definitely found that the European approach has become more refined over time. There are still some elements that we need to look at closely. In particular, I think what's very important in the context of today's discussion are the proposed provisions on international data transfers. These relate to non-personal data, to personal data as well in some instances. They relate to public sector data, and to data that is shared in these data sharing through data sharing intermediaries. So these provisions relate to the process also to comply with third countries' access requests. And actually, the provisions are very complex. And the fact that they apply also to non-personal data is a question. I think especially we should pause and think if introducing another adequacy mechanism for non-personal data is the right approach. Or maybe we should think of something that is more scalable, that does not require the European Commission to take action for every single third country. Now, obviously, that type of adequacy would rely on different elements and different factors, but it would still be a fairly complex process and something that definitely takes away from sort of the automatic or semi-automatic process that I think private business would like to prefer. And then more broadly, and I'll stop there, there are, I think, open questions that cannot easily be attached to one or the other specific initiative, but rather to a situational context where we have many developments happening in parallel with the Data Governance Act, but also the Cloud Federation Declaration, GaiaX, and also some ideas around AI regulation and testing, for example. And these share some common features, related to potential additional requirements or presumptions that sometimes work against non-European actors. All these, I think, are factors that we need to put into the bigger equation.
If I may just follow up, it comes back to what we were talking about in terms of common values. So I think what we saw with the Data Governance Act coming out is that a lot of the common issues, the common challenges, and also the values within the approach being taken, we share here in the UK. So there is a lot of synergy with what the bold, ambitious strategy and vision that the EU and the Data Governance Act is putting forward. We see a lot of synergy there with what the strategy we are looking to take forward in the UK, particularly around the conversations at the moment around our national data strategy. I think what is important going forward, and I agree with Guido, there's so much within it that needs to be unpacked, needs to be discussed in more detail, is the importance, though, of making sure that the strategy and the steps taken forward keeps Europe open to innovators, keeps Europe an open market to support and encourage innovators from that are developing, data-driven AI, perhaps solutions and technologies that could really make a difference in Europe to European member states, European citizens, European organizations. And I think that's really, really key and important to maintain going forward, and something that we look forward to working with the EU on as its plans are taken forward. But there's a lot more to be discussed there, I think, as we go forward.
Torsten, I think you had an extra comment that you wanted to make. The floor is yours.
Yeah. When I was referring to the Data Governance Act, I forgot one thing to mention. I think we'll really fine with these, mentioning that citizens and businesses should have control over their data, or should have control over the data back, and that data and data spaces need to become interoperable across sectors. I think this is clearly right. There is one thing, the intermediaries, which are mentioned in the Data Governance Act, and from International Data Spaces Association perspective, we are keen to caution against focusing too quickly on these new entities, these intermediaries that will provide data services in the new European data ecosystem, because we think that maybe it's not we should maybe put emphasis on the public-private partnership, and to ask this PPP to take care of this in a predefined future period. Maybe not to exclusively focus on these new entities which are somehow regulating data flows. I think, like Guido also said, one have to digest, one have to ask what exactly is meant with these intermediaries before really supporting these statement. Thank you.
Great, thank you. 3 really interesting perspectives on the DGA. Thank you, and incredibly topical, as I've already said. I'm aware that Mr. Sinclair, we haven't come to you for some time, and we'd love to hear the third country perspective as always. And we've actually had a question from the audience on a slightly different topic, and you may or may not be able to answer this in full, I'm not sure, but let's give it a go. It's from Yamel, and the question is, what are the steps needed to revitalize, initiate the dialogue with China or Russia on issues related to digitalization and AI, cybersecurity, to avoid further fragmentation and division of cyberspace? Is that something you could take forward, do you think?
I'll give it the college try. I mean, it's a big geopolitical Gordian knot that we're talking about here. I would say I would go back to my values starting point, and the need to build trust and demonstrate adherence to the rule of law. And you look, frankly, at what is going on domestically in in terms of cyberspace in certain countries, and it doesn't inspire confidence. Whether you're talking about freedom of media or a balkanized internet. So I think there needs to be some, frankly, confidence-building steps taken. We do engage in many multilateral fora on these issues. We're following what's going on in the Council of Europe with GPHA as well, very closely. I can't say what Russia's negotiating position is in that forum off the top of my head, but you know, I think there's a fair amount of work to be done, frankly, and I revert back to my values and rule of law starting point.
Yes, it seems like trust and shared values has been a common theme throughout this discussion. Probably the two key words that will kind of come out of this panel. There's another question, but it's slightly from the green angle, and I'm not really entirely sure who might be able to answer this question, but I'll put it to the floor. It's, what is the carbon footprint of data usage? And I suppose, how can we possibly combat this carbon footprint? I'm wondering if anyone might be able to speak to that. That's a question from the audience.
Well, it's an extremely topical question, and it's an extremely detailed one as well. In fact, it could be a panel all of itself, and maybe if the conference people are listening, perhaps it's a panel to have for another day. And it's definitely something that we as an industry are looking at, of course, in terms of how some of the issues around data, we need to address some of these questions, but also how technology itself can be an enabler of addressing climate change and issues around that are affecting our planet and all of us as well. So particularly around from my work, which is a little off course, but I don't know if this is helpful, looking at the way a move to organizations using more cloud computing, for example, can actually help prevent or reduce the amount of carbon that is being used, or help to address some of these issues as well as we move forward, given the energy efficiency, the amount of resources that industry puts into making sure that its infrastructure is the most efficient and energy efficient it can be. So I think it's an important question, but I think it needs to be looked at as well as, what are some of the questions, and there are loads of reports and statistics and figures out there, which I don't have off the top of my head, apologies, but also how technology, and this is a conversation that Tech UK is very keen to have, particularly as in the UK we move to hosting COP26 next year, how technologies, including AI, including cloud, can be an enabler of addressing some of these issues as well going forward.
Thank you, Sue. Yes, indeed. I think probably that needs a whole separate panel and, some further discussion indeed. I'm wondering if we draw things back to kind of the core of what we're discussing here. And I wanted to put it out there in terms of the theme of forced data sharing. I'm wondering whether one of you might speak to the question of, when is forced data sharing appropriate? And will the EU mind if/when China forces EU businesses to share data with Chinese companies? That's obviously quite a controversial second follow-up, but if you would be happy to speak to forced data sharing, we'd love to hear from you. Torsten, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah. I was just thinking, we also have a couple of members from China, from Japan, from other Asian countries, also from the Americas. And I think in B2B scenarios, forcing someone to share data never works appropriately, because then you are out of business. And sometimes, of course, it is part of the business model of corporations that within these business model, data sharing is a must to to run the business or to run these business models. And then it is just a matter of fact that data has to be shared if someone wants to earn money. I don't know if it is the right expression then to already talk about forced data sharing, because it is in a B2B scenario, it is negotiated upfront and everyone is free, well, to say, okay, I join, or no, I won't join. And I think we also witness this in a lot of companies, and especially SMEs, also big and rich SMEs who have something in their data storages which never ever will be shared with others, because it's their, so to say, their business secret, and companies are really thinking about before sharing the data. And this is exactly why, well, we are working extremely fast on these topics of, well, setting up a trusted environment where certification leads to trusted data sharing. And I think if this will be in place, this is what, by the way, within the in the Data Act or in the data strategy and also in the Gaia-X approach is called the soft data infrastructure. If this is in place, I think then we do not even longer talk about forcing someone to share data. Then it is just a matter of fact within a company's business model that data has a certain value, and if you want to make more out of this value, then of course you will share your data if it is in a trusted environment.
Right. So kind of just with the certification and putting it in the right context, it can be very, very beneficial, I suppose, is what you're saying. Sue Daly or anyone else on the panel, would anyone else like to speak to that issue? No, okay. We actually, sorry, we have a follow-up question for you, Torsten, from the audience. Do you expect that the novel approach to data would significantly change the business models of companies whose core business is advertising?
Well, the first part, before I read advertising, or I heard advertising, I would definitely say yes, of course. I mean, what I explained before, the data ecosystems work in a different way, and new business models, you can observe new business models in all domains, in all industries when it comes to data sharing. So also the way companies position themselves. Yeah, for instance, if you see the different roles in the data ecosystems, you have companies who focus on broker services. You have companies who are focusing on identification schemes. But now talking about advertising, I'm not an advertising expert, so I think yes, it will change. But if you ask me how, then I have to admit I'm not an advertising expert. But I think definitely you all already witness and see that business models also in media and in advertising change dramatically.
Yes, indeed. Probably another question that we'd have to dive into in probably another panel, along with the carbon footprint question. Mr. Sinclair, I'm wondering if we bring you in from sort of the third country perspective. I'm wondering, how can we ensure data-driven innovation is envisioned as a global opportunity to working with other countries and address the rise of China in the global technology race?
Okay. Well, I'd start off by touching on some of the themes that others have already raised. You know, the quality of the data and having as many inputs onto the data sets as possible is extremely important in order that the AI actually has as many good inputs as possible to drive the benefits. You see that on, say, facial recognition software, where if you don't have a broad set of inputs, you get a high error rate. That's been documented. But more to the point, if I would just urge that we not take a sort of beggar thy neighbor approach on these issues, and where you have shared value sets, that should be driving our approach in this area. So the EU, the US, Canada, we should not be fighting amongst ourselves, on these issues. We're allies, we're staunch allies. And if we take a balkanized approach to these issues, we won't be competitive. We will be left behind. So I'd say that's my starting point on that question.
Great, thank you. I'm actually wondering, we don't have too much longer left. I suppose I wanted to take this opportunity to really hear from you in terms of what are your absolute priorities for data in the years ahead, or what do you think the EU's, let me kind of rephrase that, what do you think the EU's absolute priorities should be in the years ahead to really push forward with AI technology development? I'm wondering if you can just round up in sort of a couple of sentences what your opinion on that is to start to conclude this session. And I'm wondering, Guido, if we could bring you in at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Natalia. Obviously, it's never easy to single out one priority. There are so many issues that are equally important. And, we mentioned some of these in terms of, for example, governance of non-personal data, international transfers. I think, though there is one that stands out for its urgency and its impact, which is, working towards a balanced approach to resolve the current uncertainty around international transfers of personal data. And, Bruno Giancarelli, unfortunately, was not on this panel, but I'm sure, this would have been something that is obviously very close to him. After the Schrems II ruling of the European Court of Justice last summer, there has been incredible uncertainty, specifically on transatlantic transfers of data, but also, when you look at the standard contractual clauses on the global picture. So fixing transatlantic personal transfers, I think in the short term is an absolute priority. We're talking about disruption to a whole ecosystem that goes far beyond the more than 5,000 Privacy Shield certified companies and includes many European smaller businesses that are seeking legal certainty. And, specific to that, there is right now a very important discussion taking place in relation to the recommendations that the European Data Protection Board has published recently and is trying to finalize before the end of the year, which I think, they could have a lot of value by providing a toolbox of pragmatic measures to help comply with the Schrems II ruling. We have some concerns because actually we see that, the way they're drafted now, they actually go beyond the requirements of the ruling, and they also depart from the risk-based approach in the GDPR. So we are working intensively, for the consultation to try to fix this. Then, if you look at the longer term, the solution also likely involves some kind of international pledge or international agreement regarding best practices about surveillance, about privacy and transfers. That can include as many third countries as possible. And I think this leads me actually back to the question on global competitiveness and what Robert Sinclair has just talked about. The AI ecosystem is global, and technology is not developed in regional silos. So the most effective means of developing one's AI agenda is to expand the discussion beyond the national borders. Even the Commission in the white paper a few months ago rightly makes a commitment to international cooperation on AI based on promotion of fundamental rights. But I agree with Ambassador, the significance of partnerships with like-minded countries and recognition of mutual interdependence cannot be overstated.
Lovely. And speaking about partnerships with like-minded countries, Sue Daly, I'm wondering if we could bring you in, so you might be able to round up on what you think would be best to facilitate better data sharing, whether it's from the EU perspective or whether it's from the UK perspective.
Well, absolutely. And to touch on, I think, your comment as well around what the EU's priorities need to be. So, of course, AI is driven by data, so data sharing, data access is obviously extremely important, and a key enabler of that is, as we've talked about today, is maintaining and continuing to implement the highest standards of data protection, data privacy, and data governance, which we have in GDPR and we have here in the UK as we've implemented GDPR. And I think that's really, really important for moving forward and making sure that we keep the highest standards. I always think GDPR is the floor, not the ceiling. It's the highest standards to start from, but of course there are other developments, I'm sure, to come, because those higher standards of data protection, data privacy is so key for the other word we've talked a lot about today is trust. So we as an industry, as an AI industry, can develop the greatest AI tools and technologies in the world. But if we don't have trust, we don't have confidence. If organizations, if systems do not have trust and confidence in the AI, in the data, then they will not be deployed and used and adopted, and we won't realize all the great economic and social potential that we know AI truly has. So trust is really important, and data protection, data governance laws have a role to play there, of course, but also I think it goes beyond the law in terms of talking about, as we've talked about, values around the ethical issues that AI raises as well, that may go beyond the law. The law is obviously the foundation, it's the starting point, but how do we get this right from an ethical, from a societal point of view? And that brings us to some of the issues, again, that could be a panel in itself around, and I completely agree, yes, it's around data availability, but it's the quality of the data as well. So as we've seen this year with issues such as the Black Lives Movement and others, issues of bias in data, issues of data quality, and the impact, therefore, that the use of that data can have on people's lives, people's everyday lives. We've got to get this right. And that then brings you back to trust and brings you back to higher standards of data protection, data privacy, and values are important. So I think they are intertwined. The third point, if I may, which is slightly off topic, but I think where the EU and where the UK we have more to do, is around ensuring that we have true diversity in the AI industry, and not just perhaps those that are developing AI, but those that are testing it, those that are challenging it, those that perhaps as we move forward are auditing AI and algorithms. It's important that this industry, and I would say from this is a data scientist, this is perhaps a data privacy, data policy, data governance approach as well, is reflective of across society of which these technologies, particularly AI, are being applied and used. And I think that brings you full circle back to trust. And I think these are some of the key issues that from a data point of view, but from a EU and a UK, US, Canada, we all need to focus on going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue Daly. There's a lot of nodding from Robert Sinclair's corner. I'd love it if you wouldn't mind giving us your parting words.
Sure. I think sort of all of the above, more of the same. We've all touched on those touchstone words, if you will. Trust, if I could say, a competitive privacy regime that stays current. And as a recovering lawyer, I can say the law is always playing catch up. The law will always be, and the ethics will always, even more so now, be playing catch up to the developments, especially on AI and learning. So there's a big ongoing task ahead of us. On the privacy side, we just introduced a new privacy bill, a Digital Charter Implementation Act, just a couple of weeks ago, for a privacy law for the private sector in Canada. It's an ongoing battle to stay current and to stay true to your vision of yourself as a society. And so I won't repeat everything else that everyone said. We're in fierce agreement, I think.
Yes, indeed we are. Unless, Torsten, you have a different perspective, but I'm not sure you will. Well, maybe you might throw in a red herring, but we'd love to hear from you as well in terms of your parting words.
Yeah, I just well, we can complement that. We would wish that the EU data strategy comes up with the more concrete design principles for data spaces, which then bases on already existing achievements from different initiatives, and then works or could function as a basis for open data ecosystems, which enables provider and consumer of data to connect in a secure, interoperable, and sovereign way. I think this is in the core and well, a challenge of the near future. This is maybe my rounding up words.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Well, I think definitely the key word for today is trust. Absolutely, and thank you so much for bringing in kind of mentions of the EDPB and the guidelines, Guido, and then also the GDPR, Sue Daly, for touching on that. I think, you know, both of those things, once again, probably we could speak for another few hours on those things and go down a rabbit hole. But for now, we don't have much time left, sadly. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our panelists. You've been such a sport. It's been really interesting to speak to you about data sharing and the importance of the topic on AI technology. And for those of you listening, up next on the schedule in the AI conference, you'll have the closing keynote speeches. So wishing you a very fruitful rest of your conference, and thank you again so much for tuning in. So that's us signing off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.